They were going to take her house. Not because she couldn't pay the mortgage. Not because she'd broken any actual laws. But because her mailbox was the wrong shade of blue. Margaret Chun had lived in Willowbrook Estates for 12 years, raised her daughter there, planted the garden that neighbors still admired. But now she sat in her kitchen, staring at a legal notice that would force her into foreclosure over a paint color that was one shade off from HOA approved. The enforcement officer who delivered it didn't even make eye contact, just handed her the papers and walked away like she was already gone. Behind him, she could see her neighbor Mrs. Patterson peeking through her curtains, probably wondering what Margaret had done wrong this time. The whole street seemed to be watching, waiting for her to pack up and disappear so someone more compliant could move in. Margaret's hands shook as she read the final notice. $8,000 in accumulated fines. 30 days to pay or face foreclosure proceedings. All because of a mailbox she'd repainted 3 times, each attempt resulting in new violations, new demands, new impossible standards. The HOA board had made it clear that no amount of compliance would ever be enough. They wanted her gone, and they were using their rulebook like a weapon. What the enforcement officer didn't know, what the entire HOA board didn't know, was that the quiet woman they were trying to evict had spent 15 years designing communities just like theirs. And she'd kept every receipt, every email, every document that proved their enforcement was about to become their biggest nightmare. Welcome to Heartland Tales, where we uncover the moments that reveal who we really are when everything's on the line. Before we dive into Margaret's story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. Have you ever dealt with an HOA that seemed more interested in control than community? Your experiences matter, and they help us understand how widespread these issues really are. If you believe stories like this need to be heard, please hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day thanks to viewers like you. Willowbrook Estates looked like something from a magazine. Perfectly manicured lawns stretched in geometric patterns. Driveways were pressure-washed to identical shades of gray. Even the flower beds followed a prescribed color palette that had been approved by committee 3 years prior. It was the kind of neighborhood where property values stayed stable, where children rode bikes on sidewalks that never cracked, where everyone knew their neighbors' names, and nobody played music too loud after 9 p.m. Margaret had moved there in 2013, a single mother looking for stability after her divorce. She'd been drawn to the rules, actually. After years of chaos, the structure felt comforting. Guidelines for landscaping, restrictions on exterior modifications, mandatory approval for any changes visible from the street. It seemed reasonable. Protective, even. The house she'd chosen was a modest 2-story colonial with white shutters and a red front door. The previous owners had installed a navy blue mailbox that matched the trim around the garage. During the walkthrough, the real estate agent had mentioned that everything was HOA compliant, all approvals already in place. Margaret signed the papers trusting that assessment. For the first few years, everything was perfect. She attended the annual meetings, paid her dues on time, even volunteered for the Neighborhood Watch program. Her daughter Emma flourished in the local schools. Margaret refinished the deck, planted roses along the front walkway, and slowly began to feel like she belonged somewhere again. The community had felt like a sanctuary. Morning walks revealed the same comforting routine. Mr. Johnson watering his award-winning roses at exactly 7 a.m. The Williams family loading their perfectly coordinated children into their spotless SUV for school. Mrs. Chun from the corner house always weeding her flower beds in the same pink gardening gloves. Everyone followed the same unspoken rhythm, the same careful attention to appearances that kept property values high and neighbors content. Margaret had found peace in that predictability, in knowing that her investment was protected by rules everyone understood and followed. She'd even made friends with some of the other single mothers in the neighborhood. They'd formed an informal support network, sharing babysitting duties and carpooling responsibilities. Margaret had volunteered to organize the annual block party, spent weekends helping elderly neighbors with yard work, and contributed to the holiday decorating committee. She'd become part of the fabric of Willowbrook Estates, someone who belonged not just because she owned property there, but because she'd invested herself in the community's success. The neighborhood had given her stability, and she'd given it her loyalty in return. The trouble started small, almost innocuously. A letter in 2019 about her garbage bins being visible from the street 15 minutes past collection time. A warning about her garden hose being left on the driveway overnight. Minor infractions with minor fines. Margaret paid them without complaint, adjusting her routine to avoid future issues. She assumed everyone received similar notices. She assumed the HOA was just being thorough. What she didn't realize was that other residents were getting different treatment. The family 3 houses down had been leaving their recycling bins out for days without consequence. The corner house had installed a fence 6 inches higher than regulations allowed, but no one had measured it. Margaret's infractions were being documented with photographic evidence, timestamps, and detailed reports. Someone was watching her very closely. At first, Margaret attributed the increased scrutiny to bad luck. Maybe the compliance officer happened to drive by her house at the wrong times. Maybe she was simply more visible from the street than other properties. She tried to be more careful, checking and double-checking that everything was in perfect order before leaving for work each morning. But the notices kept coming, each one more detailed than the last. Photos taken from specific angles that made normal activities look suspicious. Documentation of violations that seemed to exist only when viewed from certain perspectives. Margaret began to feel like she was living under surveillance, but she couldn't understand why she'd been singled out. The pattern became more obvious as months passed. Margaret would receive a violation notice, correct the issue immediately, then receive another notice claiming the correction was insufficient. When she repainted her front door to match the exact shade specified in the HOA guidelines, she was cited for using the wrong type of paint. When she replaced that paint with the approved brand, she was cited for applying it incorrectly. Each attempt at compliance led to new requirements, new standards, new reasons why her efforts were inadequate. The fines began to accumulate faster than she could pay them, creating a debt that grew regardless of her efforts to conform. Margaret started attending HOA board meetings regularly, hoping to understand the enforcement process better. She sat in the back of the community center, taking notes and trying to learn how other homeowners handled similar issues. But she rarely heard about other violations being discussed. The board meetings focused mainly on budget approvals, landscaping contracts, and community event planning. When enforcement actions were mentioned, they were referred to in vague terms that didn't identify specific properties or homeowners. Margaret began to suspect that her situation was unusual, but she couldn't prove it without access to enforcement records that the board kept confidential. The mailbox issue began in early 2024, starting what would become Margaret's most devastating battle with the HOA. She received a letter stating that her mailbox color was not in compliance with current HOA standards. The letter referenced a community-wide paint refresh initiative that had been approved during a meeting she'd missed due to her daughter's college graduation. All mailboxes were required to be painted in one of 3 approved colors: colonial white, sage green, or pewter gray. Her navy blue mailbox, which had been installed by the previous owner and accepted by the HOA for over a decade, was now considered non-compliant. The letter gave her 30 days to repaint it or face daily fines of $50. Margaret drove to the hardware store that weekend, purchased a can of colonial white paint, and spent Sunday afternoon carefully repainting her mailbox. She took detailed photos of the finished work from multiple angles and submitted them to the HOA office as requested, along with a letter explaining her compliance efforts. 2 weeks later, she received another letter that made her stomach drop. The paint color was incorrect. Colonial white, according to the HOA's updated standards, was a specific Benjamin Moore shade number. The generic white paint she'd used was not acceptable. The daily fines had already begun accumulating during the time she thought she was in compliance. Margaret felt frustrated but remained determined to resolve the issue properly. She returned to the hardware store, purchased the exact Benjamin Moore color specified in the violation notice, and spent another weekend afternoon repainting the mailbox. This time, she kept the paint can, the receipt, and the color swatch as documentation. She photographed the paint can label next to the finished mailbox and submitted everything to the HOA office with a certified letter requesting confirmation of compliance. She felt confident that this level of documentation would finally satisfy the board's requirements. The third letter arrived in June, and Margaret's confidence shattered completely. The mailbox color was still non-compliant. This time, the issue was the finish. The HOA standards required a semi-gloss finish, but Margaret's paint was labeled as satin. The letter included a close-up photograph of the mailbox surface with arrows pointing to areas where the finish allegedly failed to meet specifications. More daily fines had accumulated. More demands for immediate correction. Margaret stared at the letter in disbelief, finally understanding that compliance wasn't actually the goal. Every attempt to meet the standards resulted in new requirements, new violations, new penalties. The fines were now approaching $2,000, and the HOA was threatening legal action if they weren't paid immediately. She attended the next board meeting with a folder full of documentation, hoping to address the issue directly and reasonably. The meeting was held in the community center, a beige building that felt more like a government office than a neighborhood gathering place. 5 board members sat behind a folding table, each with a stack of papers and a coffee mug bearing the HOA logo. Margaret waded through 45 minutes of budget discussions and landscaping proposals before being allowed to speak during the public comment period. She explained the mailbox situation calmly, showing photos of her 3 attempts to comply and receipts for all the paint purchases. The board members listened without expression, occasionally making notes on their papers. When she finished her presentation, the HOA president, a man named Richard Hartwell, consulted his documents and announced that the compliance issue was under review by the Architectural Committee. No resolution would be provided that evening, but Mrs. Chin's concerns had been noted for future consideration. Margaret left the meeting feeling dismissed and increasingly worried about the mounting fines that continued to accumulate regardless of her efforts to participate in the process constructively. The harassment escalated dramatically through the summer months. Margaret received citations for her garden sprinkler allegedly running during non-approved hours, even though she'd never installed sprinklers and relied on hand watering with a hose. She was fined for parking her car in her own driveway because it was allegedly blocking pedestrian access to the sidewalk, though careful measurements proved the vehicle was entirely within her property lines. A citation arrived claiming her trash bins were damaged and needed immediate replacement, though they were identical to every other bin in the neighborhood and showed no signs of wear. Each violation came with photographs taken from specific angles designed to make normal activities look suspicious or non-compliant. Someone was walking through her yard at different times of day, documenting everything with a camera, looking for problems that didn't exist or creating problems where none should have been found. Margaret began to feel like she was living under constant surveillance, unable to perform basic household tasks without wondering if they would somehow be twisted into violations. The fines continued accumulating faster than Margaret could possibly pay them. Her requests for hearings or appeals were repeatedly denied or postponed indefinitely. Phone calls to the HOA office were met with form letters referring her to the same appeal process that wasn't functioning. Margaret realized she was trapped in a system designed to be impossible to navigate, where compliance was theoretically achievable but practically impossible due to constantly shifting requirements and selective enforcement. By August, she owed nearly $8,000 in penalties, and the HOA was threatening foreclosure proceedings to collect the debt. Margaret understood that she was fighting for her home, but she still couldn't comprehend why she was under such systematic attack. She'd never had conflicts with neighbors, never challenged the HOA board on any significant issues, never caused problems that would justify this level of scrutiny. Yet the citations kept coming, the fines kept accumulating, and her attempts to resolve the issues through proper channels were consistently blocked or ignored. The answer came from an unexpected source. Emma, home from college for the summer, was helping her mother organize papers for a potential legal defense when she noticed something odd about the HOA correspondence. The letterhead had changed slightly over the years, but the return address was now different from the community center where meetings were held. Emma did some online research and discovered that the HOA management had been transferred to a private company called Hartwell Property Services 6 months earlier. The president of that company was Richard Hartwell, the same man who served as HOA board president. Emma showed her mother the business registration documents she'd found online. Hartwell had been using his position on the HOA board to funnel management contracts to his own company, charging the community inflated fees for services while targeting specific homeowners for harassment campaigns designed to force them into foreclosure. Margaret stared at the documents, finally understanding the pattern. She wasn't being targeted randomly. She was being targeted because her house was one of the most desirable properties in the neighborhood, and Hartwell's company had been buying foreclosed homes from the HOA at below-market prices, then flipping them for substantial profits. The endless violations, the impossible compliance standards, the mounting fines, it was all part of a systematic scheme to steal her home. Margaret felt sick, but she also felt something she hadn't experienced in months: clarity. For the first time since this nightmare began, she knew exactly what she was fighting against. That evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table and opened her laptop. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone, including Emma, but she hadn't always been a homeowner struggling with HOA rules. Before her divorce, before the move to Willowbrook Estates, Margaret had been a licensed urban planner with 15 years of experience in community development. She'd helped design HOA structures for dozens of neighborhoods, written compliance guidelines, and trained enforcement officers. She'd stepped away from the profession after her divorce, taking a job in retail management that offered more stability and predictable hours while raising Emma alone. But she'd never lost her expertise, and she'd never forgotten how these systems were supposed to work. Margaret spent the next 3 days reviewing every document the HOA had sent her, cross-referencing them with state housing laws, federal fair housing regulations, and the community's original covenants. What she found was a pattern of violations that went far beyond targeting individual homeowners. Hartwell's company had been systematically violating state regulations governing HOA management, misappropriating community funds, and conducting enforcement actions that violated due process requirements. Margaret had documentation of discriminatory enforcement patterns, evidence of financial conflicts of interest, and proof that the HOA board had been making decisions without proper legal authority. But Margaret knew that having evidence and getting justice were two different things. Hartwell controlled the board, managed the enforcement process, and had the resources to drag out legal proceedings until homeowners gave up or went bankrupt. She needed leverage that went beyond documentation. She needed someone who could hold Hartwell accountable for his actions. Margaret picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in over 5 years. The woman who answered was her former colleague at the State Planning Commission, someone who'd moved into housing law enforcement and now worked as a senior investigator for the State Attorney General's office. The investigation moved quickly once Margaret provided the evidence. State housing regulators had been tracking complaints about Hartwell Property Services for months, but they'd lacked the detailed documentation needed to prove systematic fraud. Margaret's records, combined with her professional analysis of the violations, gave them everything they needed to build a case. Within 2 weeks, Hartwell was facing criminal charges for fraud, corruption, and violation of state housing laws. The HOA management contract was immediately terminated, and all pending enforcement actions were suspended pending review. Margaret didn't have to wait for the criminal proceedings to resolve her own situation. The State Housing Authority ruled that all fines and penalties imposed by Hartwell's company were invalid and must be refunded. The HOA's insurance company, facing potential liability for the fraudulent enforcement actions, settled with affected homeowners immediately. Margaret received not only a refund of the fines she'd paid, but also compensation for legal expenses and damages. Her mailbox, which had started this entire nightmare, was officially declared compliant with all current HOA standards. The day the settlement check arrived, Margaret stood in her driveway looking at the house she'd almost lost. The mailbox was still colonial white, Benjamin Moore semi-gloss finish, exactly as the HOA had demanded. But now she knew something about herself that she'd forgotten during years of single parenthood and financial stress. She wasn't just a homeowner who'd gotten lucky. She was a professional who'd used her expertise to expose corruption and protect her community. The quiet woman who'd been targeted for harassment had turned out to be someone who understood these systems better than the people trying to manipulate them. Emma found her mother standing there and asked what she was thinking about. Margaret smiled and said she was thinking about going back to work. Not retail management, but urban planning. There were communities all over the state dealing with similar problems, homeowners who didn't have her background or resources to fight back against predatory HOA management companies. Margaret had rediscovered something valuable during this fight, the knowledge that she could make a difference. She'd spent months feeling powerless, but she'd never actually been powerless. She'd just forgotten who she was. 6 months later, Margaret opened her own consulting practice specializing in HOA compliance and reform. Her first client was Willowbrook Estates, which hired her to help establish new management procedures and ensure transparent governance. She worked with homeowners who'd been targeted by abusive enforcement, helped communities identify and eliminate discriminatory practices, and provided training for board members who wanted to serve their neighbors rather than exploit them. The work was challenging but fulfilling in ways that her previous career had never been. Margaret kept living in the house she'd almost lost, but now she saw it differently. It wasn't just her home anymore. It was proof that fighting back was possible, that expertise and persistence could overcome corruption, and that sometimes the person being targeted has exactly the skills needed to expose the people doing the targeting. She'd learned that HOA rules weren't inherently oppressive, but they could be weaponized by people who cared more about profit than community. The difference between a functional HOA and a predatory one often came down to whether residents were willing to pay attention, ask questions, and hold their leaders accountable. The criminal case against Hartwell took 18 months to resolve, but the outcome was decisive. He was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and corruption, sentenced to 4 years in prison, and ordered to pay restitution to all affected homeowners. His property management company was dissolved, and he was permanently banned from serving in any HOA governance role. The investigation also led to new state regulations requiring transparency in HOA management contracts and establishing clear procedures for homeowners to challenge enforcement actions. Margaret testified during the legislative hearings, helping lawmakers understand how predatory management companies operated and what regulatory changes were needed to protect communities. But the real victory wasn't the criminal conviction or the regulatory changes. It was the fact that Margaret had rediscovered her own strength and expertise at a time when she needed it most. She'd been targeted because someone assumed she was vulnerable, isolated, and lacking the resources to fight back. That assumption had been wrong, but it had taken a crisis to remind Margaret of her own capabilities. She'd spent years focusing on survival and stability, important goals that had gotten her through difficult times. But she'd also lost sight of the professional skills and knowledge that made her uniquely qualified to help others facing similar challenges. Margaret's story spread through professional networks and community organizations, inspiring other homeowners to challenge abusive HOA practices and encouraging more professionals to donate their expertise to these fights. She began speaking at conferences and workshops, sharing her experience and teaching others how to identify and document HOA violations. Her consulting practice grew, but she also made time for pro bono work, helping homeowners who couldn't afford professional assistance but needed someone who understood these systems. The mailbox that had started this entire ordeal was still mounted beside Margaret's driveway, still painted colonial white in the exact shade and finish the HOA had demanded. But now it represented something different. Not compliance with arbitrary rules, but the moment when someone tried to take advantage of her and discovered that she was far more formidable than they'd imagined. Margaret had learned that the most important HOA rule wasn't written in any covenant or guideline. It was the rule that residents have the right to be treated fairly, to understand the standards they're expected to meet, and to challenge enforcement actions that seem designed to harass rather than maintain community standards. This story was brought to you by Heartland Tales, where we explore the moments that reveal who we really are when everything's on the line. Margaret's experience reminds us that expertise doesn't disappear just because circumstances change, and that sometimes the person being targeted has exactly the skills needed to expose the targeting. Have you ever discovered that you were stronger or more capable than you realized during a crisis? Have you ever seen someone use their professional knowledge to fight back against unfair treatment? Share your experiences in the comments below. We'd love to hear about times when hidden expertise made all the difference. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, please hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.